Okay. Every day is a bad hair day with my haircut. Um, Talking about the God hypothesis and the no God hypothesis, and we are comparing them. Each of these hypotheses makes certain predictions about the world, and we compare those predictions with what we actually see in the world, what we empirically observe, and we're going to see which one comes out better. Now, I explained the numbering system before. A 0 means the prediction does not the um, the item is not a prediction of the theory. In other words, the fact that there is a problem of evil, a deductive problem of evil, a logical problem of evil, uh, for example, does not increase our confidence that God does not exist. That may not be immediately obvious, but I will eventually get into my reasoning behind these values that I'm giving. So a 0 means our confidence in the hypothesis is not increased. A 1 next to an item means that this is a prediction of the hypothesis, which we actually do find in the empirical world. And a 2 means that the item is something that could only something that we find in the world, but we can only find it in the world on the basis of the hypothesis being true. So, for example, the existence of beauty is something that gets a 2 because if God does not exist, um, under the God hypothesis, the existence of beauty gets a 2 because if that hypothesis is false, beauty would not exist. Alright, so I will give the values here. We're going to look first at the atheistic hypothesis. So here are my lists with their numerical values. And again, we're looking at the non-existence of God. We're looking at that hypothesis first. The deductive problem, the deductive problem of evil gets a 0. The inductive problem of evil gets a 1. Evolution gets a 1. The problem of divine hiddenness gets a 1. Religious diversity gets a 1. And mind-body dependence gets a 1. Mind-body dependence, what I mean by that is that in our everyday experience, the mind is identical to the brain, some people would say, but even if there is an immaterial mind, it is dependent upon the brain in human beings. In every case that we look at, every ordinary example we think of where there is a mind, it is identical to or at least dependent upon the brain. There are no minds that aren't correlated in some way to a brain in our everyday experience. Therefore, so goes the argument, probably God, who is conceived as being a brainless mind or having a brainless mind, being a disembodied mind, God would seem to probably not exist. So that's why I give the mind-body dependence a 1. So we add up those numbers, and the total value which confirms the atheistic hypothesis, so far as we can tell on the available empirical data, is 5. Atheism scores a 5. So let's turn now to the God hypothesis. The world's beginning, the Big Bang cosmologists tell us that the universe is approximately 13.7 billion years old. So that means it began about 13.7 billion years ago. The world's beginning, I have given a value of 2. The design of the world, systemic means to ends, that gets a 1. The moral order, right and wrong, that gets a 2. Aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, there is an objective beauty in the world, I would affirm, and that gets a 2. Consciousness, human consciousness, gets a 1. Religious experience gets a 1. Fulfilled prophecy gets a 0. Degrees gets a 2. Now, by degrees, I mean that some things are better than others. Not all things are equally. Not all things are equal. There are better flowers, I suppose. Better rocks. Better. You could do a better job than somebody else who does a worse job. So degrees, that gets a 2. So the total value for the God hypothesis is 11. So theism, not atheism, but theism gets an 11. Now note that this is more than double the value of the no God hypothesis. That was a 5. This is 11, which is more than twice atheism. Now, we can draw at least 2 conclusions from the previous analysis. The most obvious conclusion is that we should accept the God hypothesis on the basis of science and reject atheism. The second conclusion is less obvious at first, but I find it very telling. If you were paying close attention to each list, to each hypothesis as it was being tested, you will notice something fairly remarkable. Namely, that while there are some data which fits better with an atheistic worldview, there is nothing that is necessitated by it. There are no 2s under the atheism hypothesis. Nothing under the atheistic hypothesis gets a 2, as I said. When we turn to the God hypothesis, however, we get a very different story, for there are at least some data which is impossible, it seems, with a denial of that hypothesis, with a denial of the God hypothesis. Some data do score a 2 under the God hypothesis. And in other words, each datum of atheism individually makes it... I got a typo here. Each datum of atheism individually makes it more likely that atheism is true, while some data of theism that we really do observe empirically is impossible on atheism. Let me say that another way. The best that atheism has to offer is things that would be surprising, but not outright impossible if God does exist. In contrast, some of the reasons we have for accepting God's existence are absolutely inconsistent within an atheistic worldview. Okay, now, as I said, I'll explain later how I came up with these numbers. Okay, and I'll skip down to the conclusion. So after the conclusion, and again, this is a little bit out of order, but I'll conclude, and then later I will give my reasoning. When a hypothesis crosses a certain threshold of confirmatory evidence so that to reject the hypothesis would be obscene, the hypothesis may be considered at that point to have been proven. I think that Richard Gould was the first to point that out. When comparing the 2 hypotheses, on the one hand God exists, on the other hand God does not exist, those are the 2 hypotheses we're testing here, one of them has to be right. There's no other alternative. Either God exists or he does not exist. Based on the preceding analysis, I think it is quite clear which of the two it is, which one the rational man should accept, or the rational woman, the rational child should accept. The God hypothesis has made more and better predictions than the atheistic alternative. We may henceforth and for always assume that the God hypothesis has been firmly established on a scientific basis. At least we may do this at least we should do this unless and until further information comes in. And that is, after all, how science operates. More data comes in, we may have to update our theory or even have a paradigm shift. But at the present time, we can say, yes, we know that God exists on the basis of science. The God hypothesis is no longer a mere hypothesis. It is a bona fide scientific theory. Theory in the technical sense of that which was just a hypothesis, but no longer is because it has been proven. It's firmly established. I close this inquiry with a quote from a prominent evolutionary biologist, not Stephen Jay Gould, but another prominent evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins. But I will change some of the wording here. I'm going to substitute the appropriate words where necessary. So he was talking about biological evolution in the original quotation, but in my interpolated quotation, I'm talking about not the evolutionary hypothesis, but the God hypothesis. And this quote is from the opening paragraph of his book, Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth. The evidence for God grows... Lights went out. The evidence for God grows by the day and has never been stronger. At the same time, paradoxically, ill-informed opposition is also stronger than I can remember. These videos were my personal summary of the evidence that the theory of God's existence is actually a fact, as incontrovertible a fact as any in science. Now, this, of course, is different from what Richard Dawkins would say about the God hypothesis. But remember here, I have given an argument. If the conclusion is to be rejected, the argument has to be shown to be unsound, and to justify the values that I've given to these predictions or items that I listed in testing the two hypotheses empirically, I will next explain how I justify those values, how I came to those conclusions. Alright, thanks for watching. Please comment, and critical comments are welcome. Constructive criticism is a good thing, and it helps to sharpen both parties. So please do that if you are so inclined. Thanks for watching. Shalom out.